Hello and welcome to a new type of video. Today I will be talking about strategy for the visual novel Gnosia. Now, while some of what I will discuss can be translated into other games, primarily my focus will be on Gnosia specific tactics, and what's more, this video in particular will focus on the role of crew in Gnosia. Now, firstly, the crew's goal is to eliminate all enemies through cold sleep, that being the Gnosia and the bug. Now, for the first vote, you are going to have the least amount of information available, and that is a problem because crew relies heavily on information. We know from this particular example that 2 guard duty are among us and they are identified. That is information we can use going forward. However, because our role has no special capabilities, we have no information all to ourselves. That's why it's crucial to take advantage of what information we do get from the engineer and doctor roles. Now, if present, the engineer's role is to identify whether or not another crewmate is human or Gnosia. Now, this already is plenty of information. If the engineer investigates someone and they remain alive, that someone cannot be a bug. Now, if there are multiple engineer claims, you won't necessarily know any longer who is telling the truth and therefore who is verified not to be a bug or not. In this example, we simply have 2 causal relationships. If Setsu is the engineer, then Jonas is neither Gnosia nor bug. And same thing for Yuriko and Kakrushka. It's a similar case for doctors, as they too can identify whether someone is Gnosia or human. The difference is the doctor cannot choose from among the living, but rather they only identify the nature of whoever is in cold sleep. Now, what makes this role different as well is that the target of the doctor's analysis will always be the same, and so they will always have a direct conflict. Now, here in this case, we know that Shigemichi, who was frozen on day 1, is for sure a human. He could still be the bug or the AC follower, but he is not Gnosia. We know this because he was frozen on day 1, and he is identified by all 3 doctor roles to be human. So even if he himself were the doctor, that would mean he is still human. Now, stepping away from roles for a sec, we can talk about intuition. Intuition is one of 6 stats that is upgradable. What intuition enables you to do is determine whether or not someone is lying. Now, if they are lying, that means they are confirmed to be an evil role, that being Gnosia or another role like bug or AC follower. Now, for cases like this, with Gina opposing Chippy directly, this interaction confirms that one of those 2 are evil. Now, that flash signifies that Comet was lying. So, this is essentially just one more piece of information available to us. Now, among these 3 doctors, it is most likely the real doctor, the bug, and a Gnosia. Now that we know Comet is not the real doctor, we can take the report out of the equation. That just leaves Kukushka or Remnin as the real doctor. Now again, since we have multiple potential real doctors, we are left with causal relationships. In this case, if Remnin were the real doctor, Kukushka would be the Gnosia, which just leaves Comet being the AC follower or the bug. Now, if Kukushka was the real doctor, it's no surprise that the two would-be fake doctors are declaring them as Gnosia. Now, as crew, we thrive on information, so we will take more reports as well. We will also take advantage of the fact that we know that Comet is an evil role and see who else might agree or who comes to their defense as well. That too being information. Now, this is an alternate profile of mine wherein I have unlocked all the dialogue options, and perhaps one day I will go through them in depth in a video and experiment or analyze their reactions and combinations or interactions. And it's no surprise Comet was voted out. Now, these clandestine meetings don't always prove productive. With the knowledge, again, that no one disappeared the previous night, we can confirm that one of the bug and or guardian angel is still among us. Now here we have more information at our disposal. It is extra useful sometimes in that the engineer can inspect a doctor, and that will sometimes help clear things up with the other role, even if the engineer role is still muddled. In this case, however, all we know is that Otome was human, and that if Yuriko is telling the truth, Kukushka is the real doctor. We can use that information to expand upon the doctor's report. We know that Comet is human according to Remnin, and therefore must be the bug or AC follower. However, if, like Yuriko suggests, Kukushka is the real doctor, then Comet could be the Gnosia and Remnin would be a human evil role. Therefore, Remnin is confirmed not to be Gnosia. Of course, this theory only holds if we assume that two Gnosia do not claim the same role at a time. I believe when the player is involved, that is certainly possible, but when the player is not involved, I do not believe that two Gnosia ever reveal a role, the same role, at the same time. Now, between the two engineers, we haven't solved anything, and we know Remnin is not the Gnosia, so clearly we must pick someone outside that group to send into cold sleep. It just so happened to be Stella. Okay, now, spoiler, I suppose, for the ending. Setsu is the real engineer. Yuriko is a Gnosia. However, when I was actually playing this live, I thought that Setsu identifying all these Gnosia was a crazy coincidence or just an improbable event. So I think for that reason I took a chance and voted against Setsu. Now, for this particular vote, it doesn't matter because Gina is eliminated, but still, my decision to vote out Setsu will remain unchanged, simply because of my unwillingness to believe that Setsu could be so efficient in their engineer role. Now, despite the fact that Jonas is confirmed to be human, I'm always suspicious of that guy. And so that probably doesn't help the case for Setsu, just because they determine they are human, despite Yuriko also doing the same. Either way, it doesn't matter, because the vote ended up in a tie, and I have another chance to rectify my mistake. However, of course, I do not, and yet again, it is a tie. Now, I agree to freeze everyone here because it is nearly always beneficial to get rid of a Gnosia, even at the cost of one human. Now, here it's down to the last three, and I have to decide between Remnin and Yuriko. Now here we can do a bit more calculation, and right away I notice that Remnin and Setsu cannot both be genuine engineer slash doctors. There are actually two reasons for this. The first is that between the two of them, they are identifying that there are 4 Gnosia when there are only 3 present. The other is that they do not agree on Chippy's status. It's also useful to note that both Yuriko and Remnin cannot be genuine. Of course, we know this simply because it's down to the last 3 of us, but the reports also conflict. Now, here is where I suppose I went a bit wrong, because the real Gnosia was in fact Yuriko. However, I determined Remnin to be a definitive evil role. This is because if Setsu is the real engineer, because we know that they are in conflict, that must mean then that Remnin would be the AC follower. In this case, he was. However, there is the other scenario where Setsu is a Gnosia, and if that were the case, Remnin has already identified 2 Gnosia, and therefore that cannot be. So I thought that it was safest to vote out Remnin. However, that logic doesn't hold up quite well when you realize that I was essentially banking on a 50-50 of whether or not Remnin was Gnosia. Now, unfortunately for me, I thought that it would be okay to determine which one of the two were an evil role, whether that was Yuriko or Remnin. Usually that'd be good enough, because in an ideal scenario, there would be 1 Gnosia and 2 humans. And so if you identify the Gnosia, you don't have to worry about the human. However, in this case, since there are 2 evil roles, and I determined Remnin to be evil, I did not consider that Yuriko was also a Gnosia. Now, it's different, I suppose, if there are no rules, or if there is a bug and no engineer, or a doctor but no AC follower, the combinations and the scenarios will be different. But besides the fact that losing a role such as the engineer is obviously a bad thing, it is still a means of reducing the possibilities. When there are less roles, there is less to distract you from determining who is a Gnosia. Because instead of worrying about whether or not someone is a particular role, all you have to know is whether they are Gnosia or human. Now, one obvious mistake of mine would be voting out Kukushka. In fact, I didn't think necessarily that Kukushka was an evil role. I just thought between the three doctors we should eliminate one, and unfortunately I picked wrong. Next time, that obviously would not be an advisable strategy. Now, unless you know for sure that all those that are unclaimed are human, I think it's better to vote out someone who hasn't made a claim rather than the potential real doctor.